Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is latest episode in reading great books in the bathtub. It's going to be a fairly chaotic episode, as may well be the next few episodes, in which we continue reading J.R., the great, hilarious, comic, complicated novel by William Gaddis. It's no one's ever written a book this funny and this crazy, and it's a shame that it's treated like literature because no one's going to enjoy it. I wanted to start with just to play a little passage from the opening of Das Rheingold, the Wagner opera that sets off the Ring cycle, because that's the opera that Bast is rehearsing at the Jewish temple with a bunch of 12-year-olds, 12, 13-year-olds at the beginning of the book. And let me play it for a moment here, and I want you to listen to this just opening sustained note, because Edward talks about this in the course of the book. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. It's like many openings in Wagner's operas. I'm not a huge Wagner fan most of the time, but the opening overtures of almost all his operas are extraordinary, and this is a beautiful piece of music. Bast talks to, at one point early in the book, and I think he might even be talking to J.R. when he's trying to explain why he loves music to somebody. He says that he needs a place to work that's cut off from the world. To think of Virginia Woolf's A Room of Your Own, a place where you can just be, without all your own stuff, with the door locked, everything's closed, and you can just think, away from all the crap of the world. And that long, sustained note at the beginning of Das Rheingold, Bast uses that as an example of art which creates this huge, long, sustained feeling that wraps you up and takes you away from the world. Now, that is really what J.R. is. It is this long, sustained note which grows with complications and with counterpoints and with sub-themes and themes and characters, and just slowly just should swallow you up. And it will swallow you up if you can just follow through with it long enough, particularly these first few hundred pages. I'm going to carry on trying to do something which I find almost impossible, which is to bring out many characters and scenes and moments in the book, particularly in the opening hundreds of pages, so that you can kind of sort of find your way. Okay, so I've written a lot of notes here from pages basically 125 to about I think it stopped at 250. And I'm going to do longer sections in the future. Now it starts off. We're coming back on the train from the purchasing of the stock certificate, and J.R. and Hyde's crazy son, are going through all their junk mail, and there's the issue. There's one moment where Bast and J.R. are talking, I believe, on 127, and Bast tries to say, the kid says, what's your business? You have a business, don't you? Talking to Edward, and Edward says, no, I don't have a business, I have work. And this sort of distinction is sort of what's the few artists in the book are trying to find work that matters to them and not just be involved in this malevolent and all-encompassing business world. So we come back. Gibbs ends up with the tickets. Eventually, as we get back into the train, Gibbs ends up meeting J.R. again later, and ends up with the tickets and goes to Teets. Teets is the guy who works at the train station, who's behind a grill and is constantly saying next because he's trying to get rid of the customers who want refunds. And there's nobody behind them. They keep saying next, but there's no one behind us. When Edward goes home, he finds his cottage is kind of back part of the house, or this cottage in back of the house has been burglarized. Stella's around, and Stella seems to be going through his stuff. But also people have gone through the place and made a mess of the place. So they call the cops, and it looks like someone's been having sex all through the house. We find out who it is fairly soon. And before they call the cops, Bast and Stella, his weird cousin with the scar around her neck, have sex, or start to have sex, or about to have sex, when Stella's husband shows up. And the cops come. They start looking through the house at what mess is there. At one point, the cops note that someone's took a crap in Edward's piano. Again, shit covering up this art. And when he comes downstairs, he's kind of half undressed, and the police think, God, what's wrong with this guy? He looks crazy. He's like, yeah, he's just tried to have sex with his cousin. So Stella's husband is named Norman Angel, and Norman now runs the old General Roll Company, which used to be the piano roll manufacturing company. And we follow, again, these little descriptive passages kind of follow characters. So we follow Stella and Norman home, and then there are often these little passages where you'll hear them going to bed, and within one sentence, they go to bed and they wake up, and maybe a day has passed or 2 days have passed. And Norman goes into work, and we follow him into work, and we meet Terry, a red-haired secretary who's not too bright, who sits around doing her nails a lot, but she's quite attractive. And in the course of this scene, we find out that Cohen, the lawyer from the beginning of the book, who was trying to get this document signed by Edward, saying that he's not a minor, I believe this is the main issue. And I forget, I'm sorry, there's so much stuff happening in this book, that Cohen is in the hospital after a traffic accident from the beginning of the book when he goes running off. There are now going to be a series of traffic accidents. People are going to be hitting each other and crashing and dying, and there will be just traffic accident after traffic accident. It's very hard to keep track of them, and I can't keep track of all of them. But Cohen is in a hospital for one traffic accident early in the book. When we go into the General Roll office, Norman goes off on a 2 or 3 day business trip. And we have another one of these kind of hilarious, these kind of brilliant little passages where, from about 150 to 165, where Norman goes off and Terry and her girlfriend sit around doing their nails and answering phones for a few days, but they kind of just bleed into one another. And in the course of this bleeding, we find out that there's a lot of dirty photographs. By the way, there's junk mail and smut just circulating everywhere throughout the book, along with the normal shit. And there's kind of pornographic images. Many people think it's Terry because she has red hair, the woman in the picture, and many of them think it's her boyfriend involved in it. And I think it's Kenny. Kenny is working at this General Roll Company. So we find out these pornographic images are floating around the building. Then we cut to 160-ish. We get to Gibbs, and we're introduced to the problems between Dan DeCephalis and his wife Anne. We mentioned them in the last chapter, in the last section. Anne is Anne without an E. We have lots of similar names and letters dropping in and out of names, as well as people misspell names in their heads, basically. But Anne is spelled with A-N-N, unlike the elderly woman at the beginning of the book. So that's confusing. And she's the one she's running around with the Kama Sutra, and she hasn't had sex with her husband. Dandacephalus she hasn't had sex with him, but it's apparent that she's probably having sex with everybody else, and she's reading through this, and there's a lot of puns on the fact that Dandacephalus does these kind of psychological punch cards for the kids to take these tests, and then he runs the punch cards through these computers to decide if the kids are crazy or insane or intelligent or so forth. And the machines aren't working, so they're constantly referring to the fact that Cephalus is having trouble with his holes. He's having a lot of trouble with his holes. And one of his holes is his wife, who's not really having sex with him, is sort of the joke. Now, about 160, in the middle of 165, 170, Major Hyde, who, again, he's the foundation representative at the school, who is trying to verticalize. The term verticalization comes up a lot in the office meetings at the school. And what it basically means is what it means in our world today, which is these administrators are trying to use the school to purchase items from their own companies. So you just think of Donald Trump taking us all to damn Mar-a-Lago every week, and we're basically buying stuff from this guy in order to run the government. They're basically trying to get the school to buy stuff from Major Hyde's companies and from these large company of Cates and Davidoff and Montcrieff. So that's one of there's a lot of escalating discussion about the money, what's being bought, this kind of large international business that's involved with the Diamond Diamond Cable Company that Madame Mrs. Joubert has purchased that one stock from. You can I don't follow all of that, but I follow it enough to know they're basically running. They're starting revolutions in African countries so that they can keep control of this mining company. So we have the Major Hyde comes back from a meeting. And this is the beginning of the sort of total destruction of Major Hyde. I can't remember exactly, but one thing after another happens to him. As he's driving home, someone drives into his car, and then he gets to the school, and as he goes into the school, something else happens to him. And then when he comes out of the school, someone's stolen his car, and Major Hyde gets taken off by Dandacephalus to go after the man who stole his car. I can't remember exactly now. Again, it's just so many things happening. And in the course of chasing after this kid who stole the car, there's another auto accident. Major Hyde ends up in the hospital, and I think the kid who stole the car is dead. He dies. So that's a lot of the stuff that's happening. Now, about 164, again, we're talking about we sometimes go home with this Cephalus, and they talk about Dad. I mentioned Dad. No one knows whose dad he is, though he's eating the dog food. It's clear he's eating there's an old dog in the house, and he's often eating that dog's food. We're learning that Vogel, Chief Vogel, the man with the horribly scarred face, is creating a kind of artificial man, an artificial head. And he's doing this with the school kids. And at one point, Whiteback thinks there's been a strike, a sit-down strike in one of the classes. And what it turns out is that Vern Vogel has got the kids building something with glue. And the kids have been sniffing so much glue that they've passed out. And Whiteback thinks this is a union issue. Where do we go from here? A character named Sty shows up. He's with the insurance company. He says almost nothing in a long passage in the school, in the principal's office. And what we realize at the end of this long scene is, as everyone's talking to Sty, and they're obviously trying to please him, because we think because he's the insurance person who's going to be insuring the properties. It turns out he's black, and they're sort of patronizing him. And as soon as Sty leaves, Major Hyde says something like, "I don't trust that guy. He never says anything. When those blacks don't talk, they're up to no good." And of course, they haven't let the guy say a single word. Sty hardly says anything in the book, but he keeps returning. So Gibbs and Mrs. Joubert are becoming an important item in this. 190, about 190, JR has a payphone installed at the school. This is very important. He calls the phone company, and he makes some sort of deal where the school gets some sort of commission if they put in a payphone. And JR is going to use that payphone to run his business empire in the next several hundred pages. So that phone is an important installation. He also decides he wants Edward to be his partner in his big empire. And so he has a bunch of business cards made out which misspell Edward's name, Edwerd. So he's hiring Edward to do this work for him. And every time you'll see this card showing up again and again. Then Edward goes to see a man named Crawley. Pretty sure. Let me just double check here. I believe it's Crawley he goes to see, because he goes to see him for several reasons, but the main reason is he's bought all this crap. JR is buying penny stocks and anything he can find that he can buy for $1. And he's buying up all sorts of rubbish stocks. And he's got all the junk mail he's been getting. He's also got lots of pornography that's been coming and going with all the junk mail, because as soon as he's on these mailing lists, they just start sending him all this stuff. So he hands this huge portfolio to Edward, who takes it into Crawley, I believe, and they start going through it. And Crawley tells him this is all junk. But then as he starts to notice, he starts looking at all this stuff, he starts to think there's a pattern. He starts to believe that many of these stocks are actually worth something. So the value is going to start to go up on these stocks because they brought the attention of this kind of financial world onto this crappy stock. At the same time, Crawley sees all this pornography coming in and out of the mail. He keeps saying to Edward, you should get outside of it. You really shouldn't be inside too much. And he comes up with an idea to hire Edward as a musician to do the soundtrack for a film about zebras. Crawley has come up with the idea that he wants to turn all the American wilderness areas. So think about Ryan Zinke. I mean, I'm telling you, this is the modern world. This is 50 years ago. It's just the modern world. He wants to set zebras loose all over America's wildlife centers and turn them into kind of hunting expeditions so people can go and hunt these zebras. And he's got all this film. There's a long story about how he got this film of zebras, and he wants Edward to make a soundtrack for it. And he's offered to pay him $200, and this is going to turn into some massive mess for Edward. I want to read a little brief bit. We then cut to somewhere else in the building. Again, we're often going through telephone lines, so we'll be talking to somebody, and we'll be on one side of the phone, and we'll go through the line, and we'll end up on the other side. So we'll go from the school to the Montcrieff building, to the Cates Company, and we'll move from all these different places through phone lines sometimes. And we go next door from Crawley's office, and Mrs. Joubert. It's Amy Joubert. Again, her husband has come back and is clearly planning to abscond with their kid. Really, this woman is. It's one of the least funny parts of the book is what happens to Amy Joubert. She's this very kind, gentle woman who's got a real affection for both Gib and for Edward, and she's pretty much taken apart by this asshole ex-husband. And her father, Kate and Montcrieff, her father and uncle, want to set up this big tax evasion scheme, and they're putting together monumental piles of paper so that when they die, again, we just saw this go through the Congress just now, in the past few months, this huge boondoggle so that they can basically inherit all their money and pass it on to her in all these big trusts and so forth. And so they're having her sign all these papers. And at one point, she says, this is a bunch of crap. It's emotional crap. She calls it emotional, all of this monument of money. And the man who's trying to help her, is it Mr. Beaton, I think? He says, no, it's not emotional. It's business. And she says on page 212, it is an emotional issue. It simply is. Because there aren't any emotions It's all just reinvested dividends and tax avoidance. That's what all of it is. Avoidance. The way it's always been, it always will be. There's no earthly reason it should change, is there? That it ever could change. So, she is one of the people who's much more clear on what is happening in this world. I want to just skip to one last thing. I'm going to end this because I just can't cover everything that's going on. But there's all these little different threads that are running through it, and you don't need to get all of them, but you do need to follow these main characters. On 246, Gib and Amy run into each other again on the train, going into New York probably, and they start talking about J.R. and how this kid looks like a bit of a waif, and like he comes from nowhere. And I thought this is kind of an interesting little passage. I just want to read a little brief passage from 246. And Gibbs says something like, about the most unpromising human being that size I've ever come across. He's talking about Major Hyde's son, because Major Hyde's son and Jay are often together with all this junk mail. Keeps stumbling over him with that grubby boy he hangs out with over in the post office. They're moving in. Oh, this is Amy Jabir. That's JR probably. I think they send for things in the mail together. Cosmetic samples, if you can imagine. And all the smile that lit her eyes was as suddenly gone again behind the tinted glass. There's something a little touching about him, I think. About as touching as a bull shark. That's Gib. No, this other little boy I meant. J.R., he always looks as though he lives in a home without, I don't know, without grown-ups, I suppose. Like he simply lives in those clothes of his. Probably does. Have you ever seen him when he wasn't scratching himself somewhere? Oh, I know, yes. I have felt he doesn't bathe often, but no, there's something else. When you talk to him, he doesn't look at you. But it's not like he's hiding something. He looks like he's trying to fit what you're saying into some utterly different, some world you don't know anything about. He's such an eager little boy, but there's something quite desolate, like a hunger. She turned to him abruptly. You must have been awfully small. And then she starts to refer to Gib, who, as a child, was sent to an away school by his parents because they were going through a divorce. And we sort of hear a little bit more about this kind of sad childhood that Gib had. So J.R. is kind of this representative of a lot of parentless kids running through these books. And all these grown-ups are sort of people who have never quite gotten over the things that happened to them as kids. And it's these hugely comic moments usually arrive at these quite emotional recognitions of what's happening to these people. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do today. I will say this. I'm going to try to do a much longer period, maybe a couple hundred pages at a time, and maybe only do 2 or 3 more lectures and point out just some really large points coming up, because we're going to have Eigen coming up, and we're going to have Edward's going to have a hideout to do his music, which is one of the funniest parts of the book, this huge mess of this apartment in New York. And I'll try to just focus on a few of those, but keep reading and try to just enjoy it. Do try to see where you are in every scene. And the one thing I'll say, don't try to get bogged down in the financial details. You basically, it's all just a pile of shit that's all tied up together. And in the middle of it is this diamond cable stock of the school and the General Roll Company, which Edward and his family are connected to. Okay, good luck. It's a hilarious book. It's funny, and it's really sad and really moving, like in that passage. Bye.